me ask you guys a question. Have you ever had something that was yours that somebody else took without your permission, and you didn't find out about it until later, until after they had already taken it without your permission? Like when I was growing up and we played the super advanced video game system of the PS2. I know the 5 is coming out, but I played the PS2 when I was growing up, and back then you had memory cards that you stuck in above the controller, and you'd save your progress for the game and stuff. So yeah, so you would have certain a level that you were at, which gave you certain benefits, and maybe you were a certain point in the journey of whatever game that it was, and that was mine. I didn't want any of my brothers to take that. I didn't want them to play on my account, because then it would screw up my progress, or they would get benefits of my hard work. And so whenever I'd get on and find I'm in a different spot than I was before, it would make me mad because my brothers played on my profile without my permission. Or let me give you a little bit more of a tangible example. I was in college, and I played electric guitar for the worship team at my Christian school, and I remember one time, I would always leave my equipment in our practice room, where supposedly nobody else was supposed to go except for those involved in that. And so I left my guitar amp in there, and I came back to, we were going on the road to lead worship for some youth event, and we were loading the stuff, and I look at my amp, and the power cord that goes to it had been swapped out for one that was 5 feet shorter, which means if I plugged it in somewhere, it was just that much closer and that less movable. I like the long cord because that's one, what came with it, because two, that was mine, and because three, it makes it more convenient when trying to hide an amp off stage during a worship night or something. And so somebody used my amp, swapped out the cable, and then didn't get the old one back without my permission. And it drove me insane. To this day, I have that amp back in one of those closets over there. It's one of my spare amps, and it has that tiny little 3-foot cord that is useless now. And so it's frustrating when somebody else takes something of yours without your permission, without your consent, and it just drives you insane. Whoever took it, used it, took what was mine without my permission, without my consent. And that's what I want to talk to you guys about today. It's the idea of consent. What do we do with consent? What do we do when it comes to this idea of consent and permission? And basically, what consent just means is to agree to or allow something to take place. I like this definition a lot. Consent is one tool used to keep relationships in a good place. How do we feel about that definition? There we go. I like that. Now, it's kind of weird because consent is used to talk about a lot of things, like in my stories that I shared with you. Consent just basically means your permission. You're giving permission. You are okay. You agree to something to happen, or you agree for somebody to borrow something. You agree to whatever is taking place. That's consent. We all recognize that, but that term is used in a lot of different environments. It's used in a lot of contexts that makes this word a little bit muddy. And what you guys might be asking yourself is it okay to talk about this at church, right? Because this is something that your schools are supposed to talk to you about. These are things that your parents are supposed to talk to you about. Yes, but also it's something that God talks about a lot. So we're going to talk about it here, but don't worry, it's not going to get too uncomfortable, because there's a lot of aspects to this, and the deeper issue that we're going to be talking about today, it has less to do with what you're thinking of, although it does apply some to that. So a question that we all tend to ask when it comes to consent is a lot of times the wrong question. And so I want to frame this up for you tonight in a way that is, I think, a healthier way to look at this idea of consent. And it's the idea that we ask ourselves, will I get in trouble? Right? How many of you, when it comes to making a decision, you don't have to admit it publicly if you don't want, but really, when you're trying to decide whether or not to do something, you're trying to think, how much trouble will I get in for this, right? If we're all honest, then I think we're all there at some point or another. Instead of asking ourselves, what should we do to treat others well or build them up, we look for the least that we can do and still not get in trouble. And I think that speaks to the very heart of what this whole idea is about. A lot of times, especially, I get this question more from middle schoolers than I do from high schoolers, but I used to get it more from high schoolers, and now I just get less questions in general. But I think what a lot of students and even adults sometimes asks, and what they wonder is, when it comes to any particular issue, the question is that a sin? So whether it be in a dating relationship or whatever, is this a sin? How about this? Is this a sin? Is the line over there so I can come all the way over here and not cross the line? Is this a sin? And when we do it that way, we're asking the wrong questions, because the heart of it is not how much trouble will I get in or how much hardship will this cause me. The question is this beneficial? And we often ask the wrong question. When it comes to how you talk to your parents, like, you guys know that there's just enough sarcasm that you can give without actually getting into trouble for it, right? And probably if your house was like mine, then my dad had an even lower sarcasm tolerance. And so I could say certain things with my mom and get away with it because it was like enough to push the line but not go over it. But with my dad, none of that stuff would fly. When maybe you're at school and you're talking to your friends or something like that, and there's a person that you don't really like, you can think about what you can do to that person and get away with it and not get in trouble. Like, will that tack under their chair when they're not looking get me into a lot of trouble? Will they even know it was me? And actually, we did that, and it was not good. When somebody's butt bleeds, it's not a good thing. So I won't tell that story right now. That was the story, so point's defeated. Anyway, or maybe when you're in a relationship with somebody, you know like how far you can push the line without making the other person too uncomfortable. And we just know, basically, our human instinct. The temptation is always to do the very least amount of good behavior that we should and the maximum amount of bad behavior that we can get away with. And I think that's just human nature. It's not like we're sitting there cooking up a plan of what we can get away with. I think it's when we're in the moment that we kind of rationalize things. Because if you haven't come to a decision before you find yourself in a position where you have to make a decision of what you're comfortable with and what you're not, when you wait until that moment to make a decision of what you will or will not be comfortable with, it's much harder to rationalize. And you can kind of justify anything. And so our default in our brains, because we have this natural bend towards sin, is how far is too far before I have to suffer any consequences? How far is too far? And we ask this question in almost anything. And some of you know this because you've spent time with somebody who has tried to test those limits of your comfortability, right? You've been with somebody, maybe you've been asked to send pictures that you didn't want to send, but you also didn't want to get shunned. Maybe you received pictures that you didn't want to see, or there was a spam account that offered you a follow request and a message in your DM, and you realize you didn't ask for that, but all of a sudden there is temptation. Maybe you felt pressured to do something, and you're hanging out with a group of friends, and they're all wanting to do something like I'm going to pick on Chelsea because she's not here, but she's one of the most guilty persons when it comes to this. Like, we were in college one time, and these people were like, let's go into this field that doesn't belong to us, and let's hang out. And there was a dude that literally came out like Gran Torino style with a shotgun and said, "Get out of my yard, who are you?" and just about blew their heads off. And there was another time they were in one of the buildings in downtown Joplin, and they were like, "Hey, I bet we could jump over this building to that building." And they did it because they're idiots. But she was like, in one of those positions, it's like everybody's doing it, right? And I don't want to be the lame one, right? I'm going to have to go back down the building I came, and they're going to go around the other building. So she jumps across to this other. I don't understand how you rationalize something like that. But all of us have been in those positions, right? You'll have to give her a hard time about that later. All of us get ourselves in positions at times where, maybe people are pushing us to go further than what we really wanted to do. And so how do you navigate those kinds of situations? And then if you've been on the receiving side of this, and maybe you've had your consent violated for whatever reason, maybe it's something big, maybe it's something small, I don't know, but when somebody violated your trust, violated your permission, and did something without your consent, it hurts. It makes us feel in a way that we know we shouldn't feel, and what we learn from that is that consent actually really matters. And I think that's why a lot of people talk about it. Schools talk about it. Your parents hopefully are talking to you about it. And we're going to approach this a little bit today. We all understand on a basic level that consent is important. Consent matters. But I think we all know that it's not all that matters. It poses the question, when that's all that's talked about, it poses the question, is consent really all that matters? Because there's got to be more than just the idea of somebody gave you permission. Maybe this is especially important if you are a Jesus follower, because it is by your example and the way that you kind of go about your decision making and you set your own healthy boundaries for yourself that will really set you apart from your peers. Because most people don't do the hard work of thinking ahead and coming up with a game plan when it comes to any kind of situation. And so when we're trying to figure out where we fit in all this and how to navigate these kinds of decisions, we know that consent matters, but it's not really all that matters. It's just one piece of a bigger puzzle. But I think, unfortunately, where we stop too often is with that one puzzle piece. And we don't try to put the rest of it together. And that leaves us feeling like there's something missing. Even if we don't notice it at the time, we look back on those decisions later and we realize there was something that was missing there. If it was really just all about consent, then why do we sometimes still feel icky or still feel hurt or still feel pain after a decision has been made? Because consent matters, but it's not all that matters. And I think we all instinctively know that. So today I want to look at a passage that Paul is writing. And he's writing to the church in Rome. And Paul actually, in a lot of his letters, if you read down to the bottom line, the point of them is basically in their relationship with one another. How do you regard one another and treat one another? And it was a time, the early church in a lot of ways, in its infancy, was a lot like high school in modern day. That's a weird comparison, but in a lot of ways, there's a lot of striking similarities. When Christianity was in the first century and it was just getting off its feet, Jesus had just done his thing and rose from the dead and gone back up into heaven. Now the church was like, oh, now we're supposed to be the body of Christ. Okay, how does this all work? And you had Jews, you had Gentiles, there were racism issues, there was who's in and who's out. It's is this a sin? Is this not a sin? And how do we relate to one another in a way that really helps all of us? And so Paul is speaking to these issues, and he's basically teaching them that their reputation, the whole reputation of not only the way you live your life, but of Christianity as a whole, depends greatly on a lot of these issues and how you live them out. In other words, the reputation of Christianity largely depended on the way that Jesus' followers represented him to the rest of the world. And you guys know that because you've probably been turned off by people who claim to be Christians but live a completely different life. Maybe they have one life at church and one life at school. Maybe they claim to be Christian, but their life really doesn't look any different than anybody else's, and it makes you ask, well, what's the benefit of this? Other than believing a lot of things that seem irrational on the surface. And so Paul is saying, no, the way you live and show regard for one another actually makes a big difference. It actually makes a really big difference. And the reason I think that we know a lot about the fact that consent is not all that matters is because of the deeper relational issue that we're going to get into here in just a moment. But Paul is speaking to this, and he writes this. He says, be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Honor one another above yourselves. So when we know that when our consent has been violated, or whenever we feel hurt, or we feel pain, we know it's because consent isn't all that matters. And the reason we know that is because the bigger piece of the puzzle is honor. It's less about how far can I go without getting in trouble, and it's more about what is to the benefit of everybody involved. And if your mindset shifts to honor rather than consent, it actually leads you down a path that will make a lot more sense and a lot more healthier relationships. Paul is consistently telling people how important it is for them to live their lives in such a way that it demonstrates the love of God. And basically, this is the message that he is saying, is that value people for who they are, what they want, and what they don't want. And when you can value people in such a way that you value who they are, what they want, and what they don't want, this makes a huge difference in the way not only you see that person, but in the way you act with that person. And that's the standard of behavior. A lot of people think that when Jesus came and he fulfilled the Old Testament, he actually made life a lot easier because he lowered the bar. It's no longer these 613 commandments that you have to abide by that was in the Old Covenant. If you read like the first few books of the Old Testament, there's all these laws that they had to follow, obscure laws that we don't have to follow anymore. But it seems like Jesus actually, like, we think that Jesus made it easier. But really, anytime you're given a rule, the first thing you and I tend to do is find the loophole to that rule, right? The way that we can get through and still kind of have our way, but yet follow the rules. And Jesus actually, when he fulfilled that old law, he didn't actually make it any easier. He just simplified it for us. He said, actually, here's what you do. You honor one another. And when the Pharisees were like, well, how about this? Love one another. Honor one another. Well, what about this? Is this... Doesn't matter. Love one another. Honor one another. And when you honor one another, that actually raises the standard a lot higher, because you can't find a loophole in that. It's just when you're confronted with a situation, it's like, is this what's best for me, and is this what's best for them, even if it's not what we want right now? It actually raises the bar. But it raises the bar for our relationships as well in a good way. It makes them healthier. When we value people for who they are, what they want, and what they don't want, that is the standard of behavior that Jesus set. It wasn't just consent, it was honor. And it's just, if you think about it, honor as showing respect. Showing love and mutual respect for one another. That's a good way to look at it. You don't just do the bare minimum, right? The consent mindset is to just do the bare minimum without crossing any lines. Or to do the bare minimum that you have to do so that you can still do whatever you want to do. But to show respect, it means that you do more than just the bare minimum. You do the best for whoever you're around in every area, including areas of consent. So it includes consent, but it means your best interests are in the best interests of others, and not just what you can get out of it. And I think the reason we feel this so strongly is that in Genesis, when it says that we were made in God's image, this is huge, because we were made in his image, and so we were made to know that there should be some kind of honor and respect instilled in us. And when your consent is violated, when you aren't honored or respected, you know that was in violation of the image that God created you to be in. And I think that's one of the reasons that we feel the pain and the hurt. So when it comes to the ways we treat each other, especially those of us who follow Jesus, we're called to so much more than just the minimum requirement. We're called to honor. So when he goes, be devoted to one another in love, and then honor others above yourselves. There's that phrase, honor others above yourselves. Among many things, this means doing what's best for them, no matter what you want from them. And that's really easy to understand on the surface, but really hard to live out if you haven't decided in advance what you're going to do. When you don't decide that in advance, you're going to get to a compromising position or to a fork in the road where you're going to have to choose one way or the other. And if you haven't decided in advance, then you're going to rationalize and somehow justify to do the bare minimum or to do what you want at the expense of others potentially. So maybe you've considered sending those photos because you like the attention. But if you want to show honor, then part of honor is not just respecting other people's wishes when they are asking, like when you're asking something of somebody else, and if they say no, part of honor is respecting what they want. But part of honor is also when you're on the other side, and maybe you're considering crossing a line or considering doing something that you're uncomfortable with. It's being able to have a voice for yourself to say no and be able to stand firm for what you feel you're comfortable with. And oftentimes we place honor strictly on the person that is doing the violating. But if we're not honoring ourselves as people made in God's image, then we're missing the other half of what that means. Maybe you've asked a girl out and you keep asking, she's turned you down and down and down. Well, maybe the honorable thing would be to not keep trying or just keep pushing until she finally says yes. Maybe the honorable thing is just to stop, and that's honor. Maybe you find yourself in a compromising situation. Maybe it's you're hanging out with friends and they all want to put on a movie that you know is not okay because of some of the stuff that's in it. Sometimes showing honor is choosing to stand up for that. Say, hey, no, let's watch something else. No, let's just do something else. Or if they don't listen, all right, hey guys, I'm not feeling well, I'm going to head out. And sometimes honor is standing up for yourself. Because you are valuable to God, this also means doing what's best for you and asking others to follow you and to show you honor. So if you're in a situation you don't want to be in, you can say no. When you're being pressured to do something you don't want to do, you can say you don't want to. When someone pushes the boundary that you've set for yourself, you can speak up and be firm. Because we're all called to honor other people. No matter what the situation is, no matter if it's big or small, we are called to put the interests of others above ourselves. And so the tagline I want you guys to walk away from tonight with this message is to expect and express honor. When we limit it to the bare minimum, to just making it about consent, we miss the bigger picture. So expect and express honor. Jesus, he sees us as people who deserve to be honored simply because we exist and we are made in his image. We have intrinsic value. That's a phrase that a lot of Christians use when they're talking in theology and talking about this whole image of God thing. You and I have intrinsic value. What that means is we don't have to do anything, live up to an expectation, do what we're asked of by everybody. We don't have to meet a certain standard in order to have value. We intrinsically have value because our identity is in Christ and we've been made in his image, which takes the pressure off of you. If somebody doesn't think you're valuable because of what you won't do for them, then they don't define your value. So it takes the pressure off of you and you can feel more comfortable in stating where you're comfortable. We respect and honor the image of God in others, and we should also expect and respect the honor and honor the image of God in ourselves. So let's break down the first part of expressing honor. So what does it look like to express honor? First of all, ask yourself, am I doing what's best for them despite what I want from them? Look at your choices, look at your words, look at your behaviors, and if the answer to that question is no, then maybe reevaluate where you're going. Do you show honor in all of those things? 2, understand that there is a higher standard than consent. That consent is definitely important. It's a huge part of this puzzle, but it's not the whole piece. Part of being a Christ follower means we go above and beyond just the call to consent, but it's to show honor and respect. And number 3 is to accept the no. If you want to learn how to express honor, you got to ask the question, am I doing what's best for others? Understand that there are higher standards than consent, and you have to accept the no. So flipping that on the other side, what does it look like to expect honor? Practice saying no, first off, because some of you, and especially if you're like me, you have no problem saying no. You have no problem hurting other people's feelings if they don't respect your no. And part of that's my personality, but other people I know are not that way. Some of you are in the room, and the idea of saying no to somebody horrifies you because you don't like to disappoint. You like to please people around you. You don't want to cause a fuss. And I get that. But practice saying no in the little things. If you don't want to watch that movie, say, hey, actually, what about this? Just express an alternative. If you don't want to do whatever, just express, don't try it on your parents because that probably won't work, right? but practice saying no. Be comfortable with the word no. And that will help you. If you can do that in the small things, it'll help you with the bigger things as well. Secondly, decide how you want to be treated. I alluded to this earlier, but if you decide in advance what your standards are and how you want to be treated, then this will make it much easier, 1, to understand how others should be treated, but 2, it'll help you to be able to stand firm on what you've previously decided because you're not having to come up with an answer in the moment. And 3 is speak up. If somebody is trying to push you into something you're not comfortable with, sometimes it's not necessarily the saying no that is hard, it's just the going along with it, right? Especially if you're in a group. So speak up and let people know if you're not comfortable with something. And that's okay. It's not rude. It's just being real, right? All of us crave authenticity, right? So part of being real is being able to admit when we're uncomfortable with something. So one of the things I want to touch on real quick before I send you into your small groups is the fact that we try to make small groups a place where you can talk through things like this, brainstorm with each other. If you don't know how you feel about certain things, ask the questions, talk about it. You're not going to be judged. All the adults that are in the room have been through everything you're going through. So don't worry about any judgment. We're all trying to figure out life as we go. And luckily, we've been through it a little longer than you guys have. And so we've come out on the other side and have little bits of wisdom, but ultimately we care for you guys, and we want you to be able to feel safe and comfortable to talk about anything that you want. So as you head out, I want you to think about this question. What does it look like to expect and express honor really? What does it look like in your life, practically speaking, to expect and express honor? And look, I know that sometimes when our consent is violated, we tend to place a lot of the blame on ourselves. When our consent is violated, we tend to feel guilt and we tend to feel shame, and we want to clam up and not ever talk about it. We want to keep it a secret, but that's just the enemy at work in you. And I want you to know that there's something to be said about the health and the healthiness of talking through your past with somebody. Whether it's something that somebody did that violated your consent or it's something else, but whenever you've had that done to you, with the hurt and the pain that is expressed in that because of the lack of image of God that somebody else saw in you when they violated your consent, then it's you are not the one to blame. There's a time to speak up and say what you're comfortable with, but I understand some people abuse relationships. I know that sometimes people are put in positions where they can't get out of, and I want you to know that you have no blame in those kinds of situations. And if that is you, then you don't need to feel any guilt or shame for that. I want you to know that the people in the room care about you, and there's not going to cast any judgment. So if you want to talk about that, or if you want resources to where you can go to talk through some stuff, we can point you in those directions as well. So what does it look like to expect and express honor really? I'm going to pray and then let you guys divide up into your small groups.